Thanks for agreeing to do this. I, what I know about you is that you're a neuropsychologist and that you do a lot of work and you've written a couple of really great books. I'm sure you've written a lot of great things, but the two books that I focused on are Buddha's Brain, The Practical Neuroscience of Love, Wisdom, and Happiness, and Just One Thing, which is your 52 ways to develop a Buddha's brain, basically. Yeah. I think they're great resources.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, really. I
Switched
recommend.
to the very first book I wrote with my wife and also with an OB/GYN back in 2002 for Penguin called Mother Nurture, a mother's guide to health in body, mind, and intimate relationships. And so anyway, I had a real interest, I still do actually, what happens to women and to couples when kids come along. Because I think that's arguably one of the greatest unacknowledged public health problems in the country, maybe in the developed world, the stress and depletion of mothers. So anyway, that's what that was about.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you. I'm glad
Yeah.
I appreciate that you liked what I wrote.
Yeah, I loved it. I was curious about how you became interested in the practical application of brain research.
hmm Yeah, I think sort of to summarize, when I was a little kid, I had this sense, and I think a lot of what shapes us in life often is this kind of deep, almost nonverbal sense of things we have when we're really young. It's kind of a tent pole, that organizes our life as the years go ahead. And for me, I had a deep and a just persistent sense that people could be a lot happier than they were,
Uh-huh.
family, my neighborhood, my school, looking out at the world. And I didn't mean this in any utopian way, but more like I could just see all these little ways that people around me were kind of squeezing happiness, basic ordinary well-being, out of the air. And I didn't know what to do about it, but I had this felt sense, this intuition that it could be better. So that kind of was a big part of a journey I've been on through psychology, contemplative practice, and then the last 10 years, a deep dive into neuroscience, which occurred at the same time that neuroscience has just exploded with its knowledge base. And so it had seemed to me that absent a other than whatever mysterious transcendental X factor there may be, the bottom line, the final common pathway on whether we suffer or feel happiness, well-being, inner peace, and love is what our brain is doing. In other words, all the causes and conditions that flow through us, whether they're worldly conditions or bodily conditions or the impact of life experiences on us, the ultimate pathway for them to manifest in us, which then shapes how we experience and how we act, is what the brain is doing. So if we could become more skillful with what's going on inside the 3 pounds of tofu inside,
Right, I like that
right?
reference. Yeah.
Yeah. If we could become more skillful with that, then we would have more agency, more power to regulate ourselves better and to influence ourselves and thereby send ripples, of benefit out from us into our relationships and then out further into the wider world. So to me, at a time when many people feel quite beleaguered and at effect, they're kind of pushed around by large-scale forces and local forces like the people they live with, sleep with, work with, etc., and by their reactions to those people. At a time like this, just to me, it's wonderful to be a lot more capacity to be a hammer instead of a nail, at least inside one's own mind. And also as we look out now into the 21st century with caveman brains, cavewoman brains, very shaped by harsh evolutionary pressures to develop brains that are really primed to, move into fear and anger or greed and drivenness and addiction or, kind of a clinging to us and a fear and aggression toward them. As we enter the 21st century, 7 billion people stuck on one little lifeboat, right?
Right.
No longer having to live in these kind of hunter-gatherer bands that rarely made contact with each other. And when they did, it was usually to kill each other as best they could. Yes, there was some trade, but mainly it was pretty intense, pretty lethal, about 15 times the death rate between hunter-gatherer band violence between bands as in all the wars of the 20th century. That's pretty intense to think about. So we have these primal tendencies, if you will. We also have wonderful capacities, but to keep nurturing those wonderful capacities and guard and regulate those problematic ones that are the legacy of evolution. To me, this is one of the primary, that's a way to really define the challenge for the human race in the 21st century, for humanity altogether. And if we don't get more skillful at regulating these primal inclinations in the caveman, cavewoman brain, I fear for the cliff that the world is careening toward. So those are all reasons that got me interested in this territory. And I have a personal interest in it,
Yeah, obviously.
Personal level, not to be a jerk with my wife. I'm approaching my 30th wedding anniversary, and to be a decent dad with our 24-year-old and 21-year-old kids, and an ordinary good guy. And also I have a real interest in spiritual practice in a deep way, and so I'm very interested in, for people in the West who are not monastics, who don't have the benefit of the 24/7 grinding and polishing in the tumbler, that monastery.
Right.
For people who have a real interest in awakening or going very far along that path, who have householder lives, they have jobs, they have commutes, they have mortgages, they have pets, they have bills, they have in-laws, whatever.
Yeah, life happens, right?
Yeah, all that. And how can we use the emerging findings of brain science to intervene inside our own brains, basically.
Yeah, my training
to further the conditions that really drive awakening, even in really, really busy lives. Okay, thanks.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. I apologize for that. But I was just thinking that my training as a family systems therapist, was really drilled into us that, and as a social worker, that information is power. And when people can understand the context of what's going on for them internally or externally, then they're better positioned to create change. Yeah. And that's part of the reason why I really love your work, because it's so practical. When I describe to my clients what may be happening in their brains, it's like a light bulb goes off, and and here's some ways to think about it, and here's what you can do. I just think it's terrific.
Good. Yeah. To me, that's what motivates. It's interesting. You probably know this. I do this usually weekly, freely offered micro e-newsletter called Just One Thing.
Right, I subscribe to that, I
suggest a practice and a little thing to just keep in the back of your mind, or just sort of focus on for the week, or bring to bear, when the oatmeal starts flying. And the one I'm working on right now is called Make the Offering. And I think deep in us, we all want to make an offering. We want to give, we want to contribute, we want to deliver value, and it's very innate to us. It's one of the really wonderful things, about humanity. And for me, it's just wonderful to have this chance to make my own offering as best I can, right? To cast my own bread upon the waters.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of good research coming out about gratefulness and gratitude and how important that is for health, physically and emotionally. Yeah. So how would you what do you describe as a Buddha's brain? What is a Buddha's brain?
Yeah, well, I think about that a lot, actually, because it's a kind of reverse engineering. If we start to, it's clear to me that factually, throughout history and in the world today, there are people who are very, very, very far along in terms of maturity, development, and so forth. And they, I had a friend who lived with, he was a monk for 9 years in, I think, Thailand, and I asked him once if he ever met anybody who was enlightened, and he laughed. He said, well, in that culture, you really need to live with people for many years, 10 years or more, even before, you really even think of using a word like that for people. It's not like the West, where people have a white light experience. The next thing you know, they have their own television show and so forth. Right. That was one. But two, he said, there were people who either were considered really, really realized or, very close to it. And I said, what were they like? He said, well, two things. First, they had a lot of energy. They were engaged with the world and made a contribution. In other words, they didn't become absorbed in a selfish way and just kind of blissing out and, gazing at their navel. Right. The other thing, he said they were always the same. I went, huh? What do you mean? He said, well, they'd be different moment to moment in very ordinary ways, but fundamentally they were the same. You know, if you treated them well, they really loved you. If you treated them badly, they really loved you. They
Huh.
were just, in other words, their happiness and their inner peace and their open-heartedness was not based on external conditions. It was unconditional, you know, because they had just gotten to that place where, in their mind, greed, hatred, and delusion literally no longer arose. So for me, as a guy who quite a interest in and knowledge about evolutionary neuropsychology, that fascinates me because the brain is not designed to lack greed, hatred, and delusion, you know, and heartache as well, I would throw
Right.
in. I mean, those are great ways to get lizards, rats, monkeys, and hominids and early humans to survive. So what in the world is going on in the brain of a Buddha? I mean that's, or dialing it back, you know, what's going on in our brains when we're in a really good place? We've all had that experience where
Right.
we've been to a really good place, you know, crazy stuff's going on around us, and somehow we feel calm, cool, clear, and strong inside. Maybe our body's shaking. Maybe we're rattled. Maybe there's anger or fear or sadness floating around, but boom, there's something really core there. Or maybe we're just in a deeply happy, joyful, you know, peaceful, wonderful place. What's going on? So, working backwards, if we understand more what's going on in those substrates, we can then use mental activity alone, not meds, not surgery, not drugs, whatever. Mental activity alone to stimulate those neural substrates of those wonderful, wholesome mental factors or states of mind. Stimulate the neural substrates because, you know, when neurons fire together, they wire together. If you stimulate those substrates, you strengthen them. Right?
Right.
So to me, that's the frame for this. And so what I mean specifically by a Buddha brain is I go back to the original meaning of the word Buddha, which means to know deeply, to see deeply, to understand fully. So a Buddha, as it were, the Buddha, is someone who sees utterly clearly into the nature of things. And on the basis of that seeing, is able to operate in life on the basis of fundamental inner peace, fundamental contentment and happiness, and a fundamentally felt sense of being loved and loving. That's what I mean by a Buddha brain. And so we're all on the path. And in that way of looking at it, it's about the, you know, the full actualization of the potential in the human brain, the brain that we all have, Christian, atheist, Muslim, Jew, shamanic culture, Hindu, or none of the above, whatever, you know. And so for me, a Buddha brain is the opportunity for humanity as a whole, right? And so that's what I mean by a Buddha brain, which is for everybody, regardless of their background.
You talk about the negativity bias, which strikes me as really getting in the way of having a Buddha brain, and that I guess that's the journey for all of us, is to learn how to manage that negativity bias so we
Yeah,
can get more Buddha-like.
yeah,
Can you talk about the negativity bias?
yeah, definitely. And it's interesting to think about this because deep down, we already have a Buddha brain. In
Uh-huh.
other words, when it's very interesting that, you know, as the brain evolved in three stages, reptilian, mammalian, and primate, in order to meet three needs: avoid harm, approach reward, attach to others. When we're not disturbed, when those needs are basically met, in other words, and we're not disturbed by pain or fear or threat, or we haven't just been voted off the island, you know,
Yeah.
the brain defaults to a natural state of, in terms of those three needs, right, for safety, you know, fulfillment and belonging. The brain defaults to a basic state of peacefulness, happiness, and love. That's great. That's the foundation of a Buddha brain. I mean, a truly Buddhaized brain, you know, it's gone all the way, has to really, you know, perfect that underlying state to a sublime extent, or purified. Okay, fine. But it's an enabling condition of that fundamental ground in terms of those three needs and those three layers of the brain of basic fundamental peacefulness, you know, contentment and love. Okay, that's the good news. Bad news. Mother Nature also endowed us with a brain that, on a hair trigger, tips away from basic, you know, peacefulness to, in the Buddhist terminology, hatred. In other words, anger, fear, aversion, resistance, fight or flight. or it tips away from basic happiness into frustration, disappointment, drivenness, addiction, or it tips away from basic sense of belonging and love into a sense of loneliness, heartache, rejection, feeling narcissistically injured, devalued, and ashamed, if you will. So, that's the brain we've got. And the problem is because those negatives constitute the greatest threat to survival, the brain is really focused on looking for bad news. And when it finds it, it reacts intensely. It fast tracks that experience and everything around it, the events around it, the stimuli around it, the environment, the setting around it, what happened around it. It fast tracks all that into emotional memory, just like that. Once burned, twice shy. And then it readies it in terms of storage, the brain does, so that it can be retrieved at anything that's remotely like, that stuff. Because that's what those little lizards and squirrels and monkeys and cavemen, cavewomen needed. Okay, that's the negativity bias. The problem is that positive experiences don't have dedicated memory systems to be stored in emotional memory. So they tend to flow through the brain like water through a sieve.
Oh, that's interesting.
Get caught every time, making the brain, as I say, you've heard me say it, like Velcro for the negative, but Teflon for the positive. And the negativity bias shows up in lots and lots of ways. There are a few exceptions to it. There's a optimism bias for certain things, and people tend to edit recollections of their personal history and tend to edit out pain. But in terms of emotional memory, body memory, some feelings, the subtleties of expectations, our biases in terms of how we respond or see the world, what our priorities are, what becomes imperative in the moment. It's very organized around the negative. I mean, a couple examples, therapists are aware of course, John Gottman's findings that, that long-term strong relationships need to have at least a 5-to-1 ratio of positive interactions to negative ones. If you fall below that level, it's a risk factor for divorce or other forms of separation. And it implies that, in effect, one negative interaction is as powerful as 5 positive ones, right? And so, or think about people's vulnerability to learned helplessness. Seligman's work, starting with animal studies and so forth, and then moving into human studies, where it's so easy to train people in a sense of futility, entrapment, and defeat. And once they have that training in childhood or their last job or last relationship, etc., once they have that training, it takes a lot of counter training. It takes 5-10 times as much counter training to undo that original training. Again, that's an example of the negativity bias. Or the amygdala, the alarm bell of the brain. It's continually tracking the hedonic tone, moment to moment, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, called the feeling tone in Buddhist psychology. But this hedonic tone, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, the amygdala will activate around positive experiences. People often talk about it as if it's only for negative things. It's not. It's tracking big opportunity and big threat, but about 2/3 of its cells are focused on threat. It's weighted towards scanning for bad news.
That's the default.
It's bad news that usually has the urgency and the impact. You got to get carrots and avoid sticks, right? But if you fail to get a carrot today, you'll probably have a chance at a carrot tomorrow. But if you fail to avoid that stick today, whack, no more carrots forever. Thus the negativity bias.
So if I understood you correctly, that we don't have a dedicated part of our brain to encode the positive experiences, so they tend to float out more. They're less, they don't stick.
Yeah, they tend not to unless we really savor them, unless we trick the brain. That's where my stuff on taking the good comes in. The 4th chapter in Buddha's brain and the second little practice in Just One Thing. If we trick the brain by doing what any school teacher knows, which is to say, if the longer you stay with something, the more whole body it is, the more experiential it is, and the more intense it is, right? As well as the more personally relevant it is, you're just going to build up more of a trace, as it were, bit by bit, synapse by synapse in emotional memory, implicit memory, and that's how we can. That's a major way to defeat the negativity bias, to look for positive experiences, and then when you find them, right, based in reality, based on facts,
right,
not rose-colored glasses, when you find them, really stay with them, rest your attention on them for 10 or 20 seconds in a row to force them in. Any time you do that won't change your life, but do it for a few weeks in a row, you will really feel a difference.
And that's where mindfulness comes in, it sounds like, the mindfulness
Yeah,
practice.
mindfulness of the positive, mindfulness kind of metacognitive,
Right.
monitoring of, yeah, I'm going to look for the positive because that's how to help me. I need to be on my own side here, obviously, to do this. That's the first practice in just one. Get on your side, because that's foundational of everything.
Right.
But yeah, so mindfulness, and also as you say, the mindfulness to sustain attention to the positive experience. It's in meditation language, it's a micro concentration practice. For those 10, 20, 30 or more seconds, you are really becoming absorbed in, you're giving yourself over to the positive experience. And for that very brief period of time, at least, you're letting go of everything else, or you're creating sanctuary away from everything else to really have this positive experience.
Yeah, taking those breaks that you write about in Just One Thing is, very important. And I think I'm feeling that it's fairly reassuring to know that the positives don't really stick, because I think a lot of people get frustrated that their brain keeps going to the negative, and that they feel that it's really hard to incorporate these positive thoughts and to make them stick. And so I think having that knowledge that it's not that there's something wrong with you or that you just can't do it right, excuse me, but it's that we're kind of hardwired, I'm sorry, in a way that makes that very difficult.
Yeah, I'll
That's
take a
interesting.
drink for both of us here.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take one too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, so let me just look here for a minute. Yeah, just to get back to the negativity bias and what you were just talking about in terms of mindfulness. Just as a practical example, this morning I woke up at 4 and could not get back to sleep. So I read, and it was fine. And then about 5:36, I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be a bad day. And you know how the brain goes. And I had just read in your book how to smile, and how that kind of, resets some things in the brain. So I'm sitting on my couch this morning drinking a cup of coffee and just smiling, and it kind of worked.
I know, it's really funny.
It was really funny.
We tend to value these lofty concepts and look down on almost these modest methods like smile.
Yeah.
It's interesting, like in the methods in Just One Thing, 52 of them, in case people want to do like one a week. It's a natural structure. And I've actually known people who've done that, and I'm going to actually do a little program this year that's focused on each week, and I'll do a little thing about the practice for that week. Yeah, so anyway, my point about it is that I did not invent any of them. I mean, I've sharpened the focus on a lot of them, in particular taking in the good, as well as probably a dozen others. But I'm not claiming any kind of originality necessarily. But to me, it's great that these little practices, like smile. I mean, people told us to smile. Obviously, we don't want to falsify our experience or placate others with a smile, what have you. But to take action, to get the face moving, to use what's called in science embodied cognition. If you get if you get the body moving in a certain direction, that tends to activate and facilitate and perpetuate, maintain the emotional and mental states related to that physical stance, posture, action, what have you. If we do those things, we both get the result. And also, I love it, we get the implicit benefit, which is often even greater, because embedded in that action is a fundamental stance of agency. We're a hammer instead of a nail, which helps bit by bit to undo the training and helplessness most of us have experienced one way or another.
Right.
And also, we're embodying and enacting a fundamental stance of goodwill toward ourselves. We're treating ourselves like we matter, which is it's important, period. And it's particularly important for people who haven't felt like they've mattered enough to others.
Yeah, I
love the bonus, in doing practice.
Exactly. And I love how you talk about being kind to yourself, so you can create the future self that you desire. You know,
Yeah.
that we have to create that future self in the present
Yeah.
with self-kindness.
Yeah.
And so many people struggle with that. All of us struggle with it on one level or another.
Yeah.
So what's great about your work too, Rick, is that it's so practical,
Thank you.
which I can really relate to. You know, I decided to call myself the Saint of Living Guru in part because, you know, I'm just such a practical person, and it's so nice to have nuggets to give people and say, hey, you know, try this and let me know how it goes for you.
Right.
You know, and so it's great. You know, a change I've noticed in my practice is people are coming in more wanting, what can I do, rather than wanting to sit and do a lot of deep exploration. And that's a reflection of lots of things, I think. So it's nice to have these resources.
Yeah, and I think as well, just on that point, that one practice is to have insight.
Yes,
Insight is a practice.
it is.
And it's, you know, you and I are both old enough to have lived through several zigs and zags in therapy world, in mental health world, psychology world, and including self-help world, human potential world. And it's interesting that I think sometimes there are these false dichotomies, and then they become almost battles between people who say, no, it's really important to go deep, you know, access childhood issues, see how they're transferred into the present, have insight into them, etc. And then there are people who say, forget childhood, just change the way you act. They're both right. You know, it's not either or. Insight drives action, action surfaces insight. It's really okay. And we're profoundly shaped. The brain is a learning organ, and we learn the most the first 5 years of our life, especially the first 2 or 3. And it's no wonder that we're shaped by that today. Like you, I'm sure I have clients who beat themselves up because they think, why haven't I gotten over this? Or they're dealing with people who say to them, why haven't you gotten over this?
Exactly. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And we don't get over it because the brain learns. It changes. You know, neurons that fire together wire together. You know, the brain's constantly changing. Only question is whether for the better or the worse, and who's doing the changing. You know,
Right.
so I think it's important, as you say, to be kind to yourself and compassionate about the impact of previous life experiences, and have insight into them, and be active. Get off the fish.
Right. It's like finding that
Get
sweet
off the
spot.
mental couch.
Yeah, it's finding the sweet spot between insight and action.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has really been a lot of fun, and I'm wondering, what would you most like your readers to take away from your books? If you could say 1 or 2 things that you would most wish for your readers.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Well, I, you know, what I keep coming back to, honestly, is making little efforts over time.
Yeah.
If, you know, maybe I'll finish with this little teaching story. You may have heard it. It's one of my favorites. You know, a bunch of frogs fall into a vat of cream, stainless steel sides. When they fall in, they cannot get out, right? So they swim around in it, you know, and they eventually drown one by one. But one frog in particular is stubborn and determined. It doesn't want to just die, and so it keeps, in effect, you know, treading and treading and treading. And the other frogs say to it, "Dude, just go to the light, you know, just let go. It's over. Give up." And it's, "No, I'm going to keep trying here, keep trying here." And after all the frogs die, except it, you know, it keeps treading the cream, and eventually it treads the cream, it churns it into butter. It solidifies the cream, and then it's able to hop out of the vat and survive. And, you know, I believe in churning. I believe in still treading. You know, hang in there, make efforts, and have confidence that your efforts will bear fruit. And take a healthy pride and have a sense of dignity in making sincere efforts every day. Little things, you know, little things that add up to big things over time. So that would be my parting thought for people watching this.
It's perfect. Perfect. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, good. It's a pleasure, Chris. It's great. I appreciate the work you're doing in the world yourself, and how it too is, you know, sending ripples of benefit out into the world.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great
Bye.
day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.